Okay, let's get started. I apologize, we're starting a little bit late, but we're still working out the technology, as many of us are. Welcome to KEI's March 30th, 2020 webinar on the state of human rights in North Korea. I'm Mark Tokola, the Vice President of KEI. We see from our registration that people who have signed up are new to KEI events, so let me just say quickly that KEI was founded in 1982 for the purpose of promoting mutual understanding between the United States and the Republic of Korea. We're based in Washington, D.C. If you'd like to see more about our programs and events, you can find us on keia.org. We'll be doing more online events to try to make up for our inability to host in-person events during this time of pandemics. So if you watch our website, you'll see more upcoming events. I hope you'll join. The platform we're using today is Zoom, but if you're having technical difficulties with Zoom, we're also live streaming on YouTube, and we'll be recording this event to broadcast on YouTube for later viewing. If you'd like to, we'd also encourage you to use the chat function on Zoom to let us know where you are physically as you're watching this. We're curious about the geographic spread of our audience. The order of the event today is I'll make a few scene-setting remarks, and then have some questions for our guests, and then we'll answer as many of your questions as possible. So please use the Zoom Q&A function to ask your questions, address them to specific people if you'd like, and you can start submitting questions anytime you like. We have two outstanding panelists with us today. First, Ambassador Robert King, who is a special envoy for North Korean human rights and humanitarian assistance. We're proud to have him now as a KEI non-resident fellow. Ambassador King is literally irreplaceable. The Trump administration has not chosen to replace him. We might talk more about why that is later in the conversation. And if Ambassador King is irreplaceable, our other guest, Greg Scarlatoiu, is invaluable. He is the Executive Director of Human Rights North Korea, HRNK. The brand new State Department report on North Korean human rights that came out this month quoted 6 HRNK reports 13 times. His organization is one of the premier human rights organizations. Off camera, we have Junie Kim from KEI, who's managing the webinar. So if you hear me addressing Junie, you're not going to see him, but that's who I'm talking to. Okay, Junie, the first slide, please. Okay, to set the scene a little bit, people have known for decades that there were serious human rights abuses in North Korea. But prior to 2014, there was a debate about how widespread those abuses were and whether defector accounts might be exaggerated. And that changed with this watershed report. The UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in North Korea conducted an extensive, thoroughly documented investigation and issued this report. Okay, next slide, please. The Commission of Inquiry in 2014 found that North Korea was engaged in systematic, widespread, and gross human rights violations, amounting to crimes against humanity. The Commission also found that these violations were being conducted under the effective control of Kim Jong-un. Exactly what's happening in North Korea can be analyzed and discussed, but no one can now doubt that widespread human rights violations continue. Okay, next slide. The Commission of Inquiry report is still relevant, but it's now over 5 years old. So how do we know what's happened since? The State Department issues an annual country report on human rights. The latest report on North Korea came out this month on March 11th. The Trump administration has been muted in its criticism of human rights in North Korea since the diplomatic summitry that began in 2018. But the State Department's new report is as tough on North Korea as were the 2018 and 2017 reports. That has not changed. Next slide. Okay, this is the summary paragraph from the State Department's March 2020 report on human rights in North Korea. I'm not going to read it all to you, but you can see just skimming it that it confirms the Commission of Inquiry's findings of systematic state-directed human rights violations that continue of all sorts. Okay, next slide. I'll point to just a couple of other reports. You can't dismiss concern over human rights violations in North Korea by claiming that we don't know what's happening there. We know a lot. This is a special report that came out in May of 2019 from the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. In this report, called The Price is Rights, was specifically about the human rights problems being created by the fact that North Koreans are being pushed onto a semi-legal market. They're in constant jeopardy of being arrested for crimes only because they're trying to survive. That puts almost every North Korean at risk. Next slide. And finally, this is the latest version of the annual report put out by South Korea's Institute for National Unification, or KINU. This report's over 500 pages long. It includes information on the reality of civil and political rights in North Korea, the economic, social, and cultural rights problems. It identifies which groups are especially vulnerable in North Korea. And it talks about major issues, including political prison camps and corruption. Okay, thank you, Junie. Okay, I'm hoping to address three general questions today during our conversation. First is, what is the current situation in North Korea? Are there signs of improvement or worsening of human rights? Second, is there a trade-off between negotiations with North Korea on denuclearization and continue to press North Korea on human rights? We have to make that choice. And finally, third, is there anything outside countries, organizations, and individuals can do to help? So let me start the conversation with a question for Bob. Of course, we have to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic. Shouldn't our focus be on healthcare in North Korea rather than human rights?
It seems to me that we're in a situation where we can both walk and chew gum. We should be able to focus on the problem of healthcare in North Korea, which is a major issue and which is something we ought to be dealing with. But at the same time, it seems to me that we ought to be able to look at human rights and focus on human rights and give attention to that issue as well. I would argue that there's a connection between the two. One of the real problems in North Korea is lack of information, which is a human right. People in North Korea ought to be able to have access to information. And if they're going to have a good sense of the nature of the healthcare system and how to improve it, how to make it more functional, we need to have information about what's going on, and that information needs to be available.
Okay, Bob, if I can follow up with you. The UN Secretary General Guterres and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mikhail Bachelet, have both called for a lifting of sanctions on North Korea to help North Korea deal with the pandemic.
I'm sure Kim Jong-un was very happy to hear that recommendation. Sanctions are not, they're not either on or off. You can have sanctions lifted for certain areas or certain products or certain goods. And in fact, the UN sanctions specifically state that there should be an opportunity for healthcare and other kinds of things, products and goods to be able to be shipped into North Korea. So I'd argue, yeah, as far as healthcare, the items that are essential for healthcare in North Korea should be allowed to go in. And in fact, there are indications they are going in. The International Federation of the Red Cross, for example, was allowed to ship 10,000 training kits and other materials that are useful for the North Koreans in handling the COVID epidemic. So I'd say, yeah, we need to lift sanctions on specific items that are necessary for dealing with the healthcare problems, but that doesn't mean we lift sanctions as well on nuclear and missile items that are helpful for the North Koreans.
Okay, Greg, would you like to comment on that? Maybe you could also talk about the connection between North Korea's abuse of human rights and the pandemic. You know, for example, are there conditions in prison camps that exacerbate the problem?
Well, certainly here in the United States, the experts who drafted the sanctions were very careful to include humanitarian exceptions in those sanctions. The sanctions are certainly not meant to target the people of North Korea. The sanctions are meant to prevent the development and proliferation of North Korean nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, and to punish the elites in charge of their development and proliferation by severing their access to luxury goods imported from the outside world. As Ambassador King has pointed out, humanitarian organizations, including Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, or the International Federation of Red Crescent and Red Cross Societies, have already been granted exemptions. Certainly, I fully agree with Ambassador King that public health is a human rights issue in North Korea. the state of human security in North Korea has been terrible for the past 25 plus 30 years at the very least. The fact that food security in North Korea is a problem, the fact that the people of North Korea are food insecure, the fact that 1/3 of North Korea's children suffer from malnutrition, from nutritional deficiencies, definitely increase the vulnerability of the people of North Korea to infectious disease. According to the late Hwang Jang-yup, the highest ever defector to come down to South Korea, this was the top ideologue of the North Korean regime. As many as 2 million people died in the Great Famine of the mid to the late 1990s. Not all of them died of starvation. Many of them died of disease induced by starvation because immune systems were certainly down due to immune deficiencies. What we're learning here in the United States and elsewhere in the developed world is that it's very important to be able to basically, well, it may be a controversial expression, but shelter in place. One needs the resources to hold the fort for a while. The very fact that the mobility is very strictly controlled and restricted in North Korea, the very fact that food security and economic security are precarious, all of these mean that the people of North Korea are less prepared to deal with a public health crisis possibly triggered by the coronavirus. Speaking of detention facilities, our colleagues at Daily NK issued a couple of reports stating that respiratory infections have been reported at Kyohwaso training, well, forced labor camp number 12 in Cheongori, North Korea. We cannot tell whether this is COVID-19 coronavirus. Again, even compared to other people in North Korea, the human security of prisoners is so precarious. They've been suffering from respiratory infections for a long time. At this stage, we just cannot tell. One argument that this organization, HRNK, has continued to make is that we need a rights up front approach to North Korea. If humanitarian organizations are involved in North Korea, they must remember to reach out to the most vulnerable. Who are the most vulnerable? Certainly people in detention, certainly those 120,000 political prisoners, including men, women, and children who are all detained together due to North Korea's Yonjaje system of guilt by association.
Okay, Bob, I know you've been directly involved in negotiating North Korea on how to get assistance to them back in the food assistance days. So if we do give medical supplies to North Korea and if they're willing to accept them, how can we make sure that they are used for the purpose they're intended for, not stockpiled or sold? I think you're muted.
Thank you.
Okay, right. I want to hear this.
This is one of the important issues that I think we need to consider when we're providing assistance to North Korea. When we were looking at the possibility of providing food aid at one point in 2011, 2012, that was one of the things we had serious discussions with the North Koreans on, is how can we monitor to make sure the food is going to those that are most in need. I think it's essential that we do it as well with medical care. North Korea is not, wants to be treated differently. The rest of the world, that's one of the issues we do when we provide assistance. We assure that it goes to those that are most in need, make sure that it goes where it's intended. And requiring that of the North Koreans is not doing anything different for North Korea than we would do for any other country. We need to make clear that that's part of the process, that if we're going to provide humanitarian assistance, if we're going to provide medical aid, we need to be able to be sure that it's going to areas where the need is the greatest. And this is something that the North Koreans need to understand, and we need to be hard-nosed as we negotiate with them on those issues. But that ought to be an essential part of any agreement with the North Koreans on providing medical assistance.
Yeah, my colleague Troy Stangerow made the interesting point too, that we need to look at relative need. it may be there are countries that actually are in more of need of assistance than North Korea is. So it's a relative thing. If we can help North Korea, we should, but compared to other countries, is it the highest priority?
Well, the North Koreans right now are claiming they have no cases of COVID virus. I suspect that that's not the case. Kim Jong-un is now building a hospital that's supposed to be finished, a brand new hospital in Pyongyang that's supposed to be finished by the fall. That seems to suggest that there are, in fact, expectations that the situation is either getting bad or going to get worse. And we need to be aware of that.
Okay, Greg, you talked about North Korea's dealing with its population, but what is their record in delivering assistance to the population? I mean, I've seen it argued the North Korean healthcare system is actually pretty good, if under-resourced. They've got a lot of doctors, there are a lot of clinics. So is this massive North Korean state bureaucracy actually well-structured to deal with the pandemic?
Mark, up until 30 years ago, the North Korean public health system may have been on par with the public health system of other communist countries. Of course, still corrupt, in some ways, perhaps working. I have my own personal story. In April 1986, I was a high school student in communist Romania. That's when Chernobyl happened. The regime of Nicolae Ceausescu, as terrible as it was able to distribute iodine pills to each and every school child at the time, as soon as they announced, of course, a few days late. However, for the past 30 years, the North Korean system, the North Korean public health system has been in shambles. Resources have been concentrated on those areas that are regarded by the regime as critical to its own survival: the military, nuclear weapons, missiles, keeping the elites happy through access to goods imported from the outside world. The public health and the health security of the people of North Korea has been neglected. And in order to illustrate that, I have actually prepared this picture right here. Well, I'm afraid, yes, this is the picture I'm looking for. This is a picture taken in the aftermath of Typhoon Lion Rock a few years ago in North Korea. North Korea is very hard hit by Typhoon Lion Rock. Remember, this is a regime that invests in building high-risers downtown Pyongyang. Ballistic missiles, has placed at least one object into outer space. Nuclear weapons. On the other hand, these men are involved in post-disaster recovery outside Pyongyang, North Korea. Do you notice anything striking about this picture, Mark and Bob?
There's not much equipment. There's no machinery there.
Absolutely. No tools. You don't see an excavator, a bulldozer. Goodness, not even a shovel. These men are empty-handed. This is how the regime invests in the welfare and human security of the people of North Korea. There is no investment. Now, systemically, is this humongous bureaucracy equipped to deal with a public health crisis of the magnitude of a coronavirus crisis? One has to remember that the system is geared first and foremost to keep people under control. This is not a line of chain of command of technocrats who can make independent decisions within a world of technocrats. Party guidance trumps everything else. Doctors, hospitals, everyone. First and foremost, they must be obedient to the party, so they work under the strict surveillance of the party. They work under the strict surveillance of internal security agencies, while the system is equipped to keep people under control, oppressed, and maintain the regime in power. One tremendous vulnerability of this system is that for that very reason, it is not equipped to deal with a natural disaster or a public health crisis, a pandemic, on par with what a coronavirus crisis could look like in North Korea.
Okay, I should have said at the start too that Bob and Greg, feel free to address each other too. I'm not the master of ceremonies. I'm just a humble moderator. So if you have things you want to say, chime in. Bob, I was going to ask you about what effect the pandemic is having on North Korean defectors or refugees. So that seems like it'd be a specific case these days. What can the U.S. do in regard to refugees in this time of border crossings?
The refugees are probably very seriously affected by what's going on. Numbers have gone down the last year or two. The numbers have declined significantly. My guess is it's much more difficult to get out of North Korea now than it was even a year ago. North Koreans are guarding the borders carefully. The Chinese are probably much tougher on the border than they were before. It's going to be much more difficult for them to get into China. But then the other problem they will have is they've got to go through China to get out, in most cases, into Southeast Asia. And crossing China at a time when travel is being limited and travel is being carefully watched, I think the numbers of defectors leaving North Korea is likely to decline very significantly over the period of time, the 3 or 4 months that we've had when the pandemic has been going on. And I think that's going to continue. I am sure that those who are captured by North Korean guards or those who are repatriated from China back to North Korea are going to be more subject to conditions that would lead to their having problems and becoming ill with the coronavirus.
Okay, I'll see. One question I've had myself is why North Korea won't admit to having any cases of COVID-19. They admit things in the past. They admitted having swine flu. They've admitted to floods and droughts. So why their secrecy about this case? I've been wondering if it's just because they don't know what to do. That until they have a plan where they can announce it and carry through with dealing with patients, maybe they're afraid to admit they have it. Do you have any ideas about why they're not telling the truth about this? Greg?
Well, certainly, first and foremost, we will have to see whether North Korea is treating this as a real crisis or as a PR opportunity. We see that North Korean propaganda has issued instructions, for example, not to gather in public spaces. They've admonished public officials who have been caught drinking, consuming alcohol during this crisis. So there is the PR aspect. For the regime surely wants to look good. There is another aspect here. If a crisis does indeed happen, one has to remember that there are media organizations that even have stringers inside the country right now, contacted on a combination of smuggled Chinese cell phone and official North Korean cell phone. This is not the 1990s. If a crisis does happen, information will get out of the country. Now, by issuing all of these fatwas, so to say, all of these instructions, what the regime is trying to do is to position itself where it can say that it did try very hard to prevent this crisis. Now, indeed, on previous occasions, they did admit to droughts, to flooding, natural disasters. A little bit earlier, a few minutes ago, I quoted Hwang Jong-yup. Hwang Jong-yup was the one who also made this point in his memoirs. He said, South Koreans wonder why, as North Koreans were dying by the hundreds of thousands and the millions, they did not rise up against the regime. The point that Hwang Jong-yup made was that North Koreans in the 1990s did not regard this as a man-made disaster. To a large extent, although there were floods and natural disasters, this was a disaster caused by the very regime of North Korea. For as long as they're dealing with an event that can be described as a natural disaster, the regime of North Korea does not regard it as potentially posing a direct threat to its legitimacy within North Korea. But of course, I hope that we will have more opportunities to discuss the potential effects of a coronavirus crisis on the North Korean regime, on the viability of the North Korean regime, and quite frankly, on the future of the regime in North Korea. So the reasons why they've kept quiet could be complex. The bottom line, of course, is that in order to determine how many cases there are out there, one has to test. We have no information about testing in North Korea. We know that North Korean statisticians are very good at doctoring data. They do not know their own statistical data. Of course, this is a huge obstacle in the way of collaborating with multilateral, bilateral, international humanitarian agencies. This is a big obstacle in the way of collaborating with private humanitarian agencies that might be out there in North Korea.
Yeah,
Mark,
please.
it seems to me that the legitimacy of the government is very much in question in terms of how it handles the coronavirus issue in North Korea. And that's true as well in the United States. I mean, even here where information is much more available, where people are paying attention, where things are known, there are efforts by our own government to keep the numbers down. Don't let the cruise ship land because it'll increase the number of people who are in the United States who have the virus. We're dealing with that in spades when you're dealing with North Korea, where the government has the ability to control the media much more so than is the case here.
Okay, well, as Greg said, we could talk about the coronavirus, what it means for North Korea a long time, but I want to step back to the more general human rights issues now. Greg, I know HRNK has done some recent work on Camp Number 1 in Kaechon. So could you tell us a little bit about that work and maybe put in the context of other prisons in North Korea? Is there a difference between regular prisons and political prison camps?
This is part of a much broader project we've been running for the past 7 years, together with senior satellite imagery consultant, Joe Bermudez Jr. This is the latest installment in this long-term project. Camp Number 1, Kaechon in northeastern North Korea, is a Kyohwa-so labor training camp. There are multiple types of detention facilities in North Korea. One fundamental difference between the Kwalli-so political prison camps and the other detention facilities, Kyohwa-so labor training camps, Nodong Talyonde encampment / mobile labor brigade, Chikyo-so short-term detention facilities, Kuryujang police detention facilities. The fundamental difference is that each and every one of those up to 120,000 political prisoners at the Kwalli-so political prison camps are the victims of enforced disappearances. They're taken away in the middle of the night. They disappear into the political prison camp systems. One point that HRNK report author David Hawk has made in his Hidden Gulag reports and the Parallel Gulag report is that sometimes these prisoners become for a second time the victims of enforced disappearances when camps in the border areas are shut down and they're relocated to other facilities, other political prison camps. One big difference between the Kwalli-so political prison camps and the other detention facilities is that at the other detention facilities, there are actual prison sentences. The prisoners do go through a semblance of judicial process. This particular facility, Kyohwa-so labor training camp number 1 in Kaechon, northeastern North Korea, as far as we can tell, is the oldest Kyohwa-so labor training camp in North Korea. Through declassified CIA satellite imagery from the early 1960s, through imagery collected and analyzed over the past few years, we made the determination that forced labor has continued at the camp for more than half a century. In this particular case, last year, we are also able to conduct interviews with former prisoners who escaped from North Korea and currently reside in South Korea. One lady in particular shared with us very troubling testimony. This is testimony about bodies being dumped in the fields and used as fertilizer around the Kecheon #1 detention facility, labor training camp in North Korea. What this regrettably tells us is that conditions, human rights conditions at these detention facilities in North Korea today are as bad as they were when the UN Commission of Inquiry issued its report in February 2014. They're as bad as they were when Venezuelan poet Ali Lameda was held in North Korea's political prison facilities in the late 60s, early 70s. He was, of course, the first one to come out of the system and report on the abysmal human rights violations happening within this vast system of unlawful imprisonment.
Bob, anything to add to that description of the situation?
My sense is that Greg does an extremely good job. The Committee for Human Rights in North Korea is certainly one of the best organizations that documents what's going on. And I think the documentation that they've provided, the continuing reports that they provide, are extremely useful in terms of providing the specifics of what's going on. In particular, having the satellite imagery that Joe Bermudez provides gives a credibility and an authenticity that simple reports from individuals who've been held there have difficulty conveying. So, I mean, I think it's an extremely good relationship that HRNK has worked out that documents what's been going on.
Okay, so to turn from that to the politics, a little bit in administration. So Bob, is it important for the administration to be speaking out at the top levels about North Korean human rights violations, or is working level reporting and pressure enough out of the public eye?
Unfortunately, the administration has taken the point of view that the only way we're going to make progress with North Korea on the nuclear issue is if we back off on human rights. I'm not convinced that that's the case. North Korea is the place where control of information is extremely important in terms of its own internal operations, and the ability to control information, the ability to handle and keep its people in line is far more important to them than the relationship with the United States. I don't think there's any question that if we're going to make progress in terms of moving North Korea towards denuclearization, towards improving the relationship with the United States with other countries, it's going to have to be a situation where the North Koreans are under some pressure from their own people. And the only way that we're going to put pressure on the North Korean regime is if we increase the access to information, if we provide put pressure on the North Koreans for the human rights violations that they're guilty of. So I would argue that, in fact, we have to, again, walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to press the North Koreans on human rights. At the same time, we need to work with them and cooperate with them to try to make progress on denuclearization, on reducing the missile threat.
Okay, Greg, I know you've worked with the UN Human Rights Council and you've observed the positions of the US government in meetings of the Human Rights Council. Can you talk about the Trump administration's policy regarding human rights in North Korea? What has the US been doing in the Human Rights Council, for example?
Well, at the Human Rights Council, we haven't done anything for almost 2 years now because we have pulled out of the Human Rights Council. for reasons not related to North Korea. Of course, some of us, I agree with some of those reasons. There are some terrible violators of human rights who sit on the Human Rights Council. That said, if there was one success story of the Human Rights Council, that was the establishment of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the DPRK, the UNCOI. The resolution that established the UNCOI was passed by consensus, all 47 member states, in February 2013, 1 year prior to the issuing of the UNCOI report. Of course, the Human Rights Council is also to be credited for the existence of a UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the DPRK. Mr. Tomás Ojea Quintana from Argentina is the current rapporteur. He was preceded by Vitit Muntarporn initially, professor from Thailand, Marzuki Darusman, former Attorney General of Indonesia. So that's the Human Rights Council. Of course, we all do remember that up until the Pyeongchang Olympics, the administration was quite active on North Korean human rights. The president gave a very good speech before the South Korean National Assembly in November, prior to the Pyeongchang Olympics, November 2017. We remember that disabled North Korean escapee activist Chi Song-ho was the guest of the First Lady at the State of the Union address. The president subsequently met with a group of 8, including Chi Song-ho, 8 North Korean escapees in the Oval Office. Vice President Pence met with the parents of Otto Warmbier, Fred and Cindy, who also participated in the State of the Union address. By the way, just a few days ago, we commemorated 10 years since the sinking of the Tonan by the North Koreans. Vice President Pence, North Korean escapees, and the family of Otto Warmbier visited the Tonan Memorial in early 2018. The situation has been very different since the Pyeongchang Olympics. Perhaps this happened before across multiple administrations. Human rights has been outcompeted by other concerns, political, security, military concerns, North Korea's nukes and missiles. The United States was part of a coalition of like-minded states that pushed for significant action at the United Nations. 3 times in December 2015, 2016, and 2017, the North Korean human rights issue was placed on the agenda of the UN Security Council. This is a procedural matter requiring 9 out of 15 votes of permanent and non-permanent members. In 2018, this didn't happen. We didn't have the votes. In 2019, just a few months ago, the United States was at the forefront of efforts to put together a coalition to support the placing of North Korean human rights on the agenda of the UN Security Council. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. It didn't happen based on what I know precisely, because we decided to change our mind at the last hour, and this didn't happen. So efforts by the State Department in particular to support North Korean human rights organizations have continued, especially in South Korea. The South Korean government, progressive-leaning government of President Moon Jae-in, has been very keen on appeasing the Kim regime, on rapprochement at any cost. Human rights organizations, human rights activists, in particular defector activists, have been sacrificed on the altar of so-called inner Korean reconciliation. The funding previously provided by the South Korean government to these organizations was cut 100%. They no longer appear publicly as much as they used to. Very tragically, just a few months ago, 2 North Korean sailors were repatriated by the South Korean government to North Korea, despite the Constitution of South Korea, the Republic of Korea, that states that all Koreans are citizens of the Republic of Korea. They'll return to conditions of extraordinary danger, to a place where they were surely tortured, perhaps killed, imprisoned. We can only think the worst based on North Korea's record. So it's important that the US State Department has continued to support these groups in South Korea. However, it is also important that we have US leadership. Significant action at the UN and elsewhere cannot happen without US leadership. Without US leadership, there can be no coalition of the like-minded supporting significant action at the General Assembly or the UN Security Council. We have seen others pull out of the coalition of the like-minded. Of course, the South Koreans, for the first time in so many years, they did not co-sponsor the General Assembly resolution last year in the fall. And even the government of Japan, that has been such a staunch supporter of action on human rights in North Korea, probably for the sake of pursuing this ever elusive goal of a summit meeting between Prime Minister Abe and Kim Jong-un, even the government of Japan has taken its foot off the gas pedal.
Mark, I'd
Yes.
like to underline one thing that Greg mentioned, and that is the United States was the country that made the decision not to support taking up North Korea's human rights issues in the UN Security Council, and the US blocked what would have happened. Takes, as Greg said, it takes 9 votes of Security Council members to put an item on the agenda. There were 8 countries in addition to the United States. Those 8 countries supported doing it. It was the United States that basically blocked taking the issue up in the Security Council. The effort to raise these human rights issues, the State Department in an institutional way continues to press the North Koreans on human rights. The annual human rights reports are as good as ever in terms of documenting, enumerating what the issues and problems are. And the fact that they're quoting HRNK so frequently indicates how good they are. But the fact that when the report came out, none of the senior State Department officials who usually comment on issues and problems mentioned North Korea. So, I mean, it's the kind of thing that institutionally is done at a lower level, but when you get to the most senior officials, they ignore the North Korean human rights issue. One area where there is still interest and concern is in the Congress. And the Congress continues to have a concern and an interest about the human rights situation in North Korea. And there's more pressure from Congress than any place else in the US government. But with all of the other things going on these days, it's very difficult to get movement beyond that.
If
Yes, please.
Mark and Bob, if I may, I will quote a very senior expert. I cannot name him. I don't have his permission to do this. Bob knows him very well. You know him very well, Mark. He made this point that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, a couple of weeks ago, gave a very good statement on human rights in the DPRK. However, as this most distinguished human rights professional was noticing, the UN High Commissioner did not mention the UN COI report. Not even once. So the way that he put it is that everyone is now tiptoeing around the issue of North Korean human rights. This is not what we used to do, Bob, when you were there just a few years ago. This is not in the remote past. It hasn't been that long.
Unfortunately, that's true.
Yeah, I saw that when Secretary Pompeo did his public announcement of the rollout of the human rights report this month, he singled out 4 countries for mention. Publicly. He mentioned China, Cuba, Iran, and Venezuela. Not mentioning North Korea is striking in that kind of company.
Particularly since North Korea probably has a worse record on human rights than China. I mean, hard to believe, but probably does.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. Let me press this a little bit further, because I think we agree that the North Korean human rights should be raised and addressed and spotlighted. The administration chooses not to, and there must be a reason for it. And I assume the reason is because they believe that in the denuclearization talks, if the administration criticized human rights in North Korea, it would somehow endanger the talks. So Bob, do you think that's valid?
No, I don't think it's valid at all. I mean, the North Koreans respond far more negatively than we've responded. And it certainly doesn't affect our ability to move forward. It was very interesting that when the President of the United States sent a message to Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-un himself didn't bother to respond. The response came from his sister. That really is an insult to the United States. And it seems to me that the North Koreans continue to insult the United States, to ignore us, to carry on the way they do. And we don't seem to pay much attention to it. And we're pussyfooting around on human rights when we ought to press the North Koreans on human rights.
Yeah, I think I might mention one more UN activity I think is notable, and that is the fact that the UN has an office in Seoul of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And the job of that office in Seoul is to collect evidence of crimes against humanity and abuses of human rights for the day when it comes that there'll be some accountability for what happened in North Korea. So they interview defectors, they gather documents, they're quietly laying the groundwork for a very good documentation, if it can ever be used. Okay, I see 3 questions in our queue, but while I wait for some others to come in, let me just ask a final question of my own. This is for both of you. So could you say what the US and other countries should be doing in regard to North Korean human rights? Do you have any advice for organizations or individuals for what they might do?
It seems to me that it's very important that we continue to raise the issue of human rights. The fact that we don't talk about it is the biggest problem. We need to raise the issue. The US government needs to officially raise it. Greg and other organizations, private organizations, should continue to raise the human rights question, the human rights issues. But to ignore them, to underplay them, certainly does not help. And I think that's one of the things that we need to do. I think members of Congress need to be more outspoken in terms of pressing the administration and pressing the Secretary of State and other senior officials to speak out on the issue of human rights. And I think this is something that we can only hope will happen.
Well, I presume that all of those friends who have tuned in today have keen interest in North Korea and North Korean human rights issues. There is a lot of competition out there. There are lots of other human rights crises, refugee crisis in the Mediterranean basin, South Asia. Of course, we are dealing with a global pandemic. We continue to deal with overwhelming security, military challenges. It is very important that in democratic countries, one should talk to elected representatives to remind them that this is an issue that continues to matter to the people of the United States, to the people living in other friendly and fellow democracies. As far as things on the ground are concerned, the people of North Korea need information. There is a human rights public health continuum. We need to continue to convey to the people of North Korea information about the corruption of their leadership, information about the outside world, South Korea in particular, and also information about the abysmal state of human rights in North Korea. I'm quoting Hwang Jang-yeop a lot today. As Hwang Jang-yeop once said, I hear a lot outside the country about human rights violations, public executions being abysmal human rights violations. Never once did I hear the people of North Korea speaking of human rights violations while living in North Korea. I think that it is very important under the current circumstances to explain to the people of North Korea what is going on around the world with this pandemic. It is very important to explain to them that we do not have a cure, we do not have a vaccine. All we have is a set of procedures and behavior change measures aimed to, well, flatten the curve. That's an expression we hear a lot these days, to avoid public health systems being public and private health systems being overwhelmed by this pandemic. Things are much worse in North Korea, and I think it is very important to explain to the people of North Korea via information campaigns run by civil society organizations that human rights is public health is human rights. Through its abuse of human rights, through its corruption, the regime of North Korea is placing the people of North Korea at great risk, and this is happening in sharp contrast to what we've seen happening in South Korea. Of course, not a perfect way of dealing and coping with this pandemic, but surely the South Koreans have been at the forefront of dealing and coping with this global challenge.
Okay, I guess my thought would be that I think the silence actually could be misleading. You know, when the Trump administration doesn't remind people of human rights problems, and when the public sees the president referring to Kim Jong-un as a great guy who cares about his country, I think people may assume that things are getting better in North Korea. The human rights is a problem that's being resolved. And the other argument I hear is that because of marketization, which is going on in North Korea, that means there must be a better human rights life for people. Because they're involved in private enterprise now, that must help. But as that May 2019 UN report pointed out, it actually could be worse. Because the public has to be in danger of breaking the law when they're engaged in market activities, they can be picked up at any time. Okay, let me turn to questions now. We have a question from Cortland, who asks if there are any updates on NGOs, UN organizations, or others working inside North Korea currently, especially those working on outbreak preparedness. What are they reporting?
I don't think we have seen any specific reporting so far. Of course, humanitarian organizations have been trapped in this predicament for many years now. Many of them, all of them are doing good work. Many of them are doing God's work. They're faith-based organizations. We're all familiar with the great work that Steve Linton has been doing, for example, in North Korea, dealing with another tremendous public health challenge, multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. One also has to remember that the work of these organizations, and we of course don't have the time to get into a discussion on how effective this is, how effective it is in terms of reaching out to the most vulnerable. There are success stories as well, but the point is that these organizations need access inside the country in order to do their work. They have to be very careful, especially under the current circumstances. Any statement might jeopardize their visas, might jeopardize their access, might jeopardize their very work inside the country. We have received sporadic reports from other media organizations, most notably Daily NK. Mark, you are on that really good conference call that Link organized last week. I and probably others asked a question about the reported outbreak of respiratory disease at camp number 12, Chonggori, in northeastern North Korea. Their answer was very frank. They said, look, there is no way we can verify this. We know nothing about testing. Plus, the state of health security is so precarious in North Korea, especially these detention facilities, that it's really difficult to tell whether this is coronavirus or some other type of pulmonary respiratory infection. So reports are sporadic. We have seen statements by the Secretary General of the UN, by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, but again, nothing from the North Korean regime. So far, they claim that there are 0 cases. And I should have begun by saying that my wish to the people of North Korea is that they really have 0 cases. There are no acceptable deaths. There is no acceptable death rate. Every death from this terrible global pandemic is a tragic death, and I wish the people of North Korea only the best.
Mark, can we turn
Please.
the question around and ask Court if he has any information about what's going on in North Korea? He's done some very good studies on some of the healthcare issues inside North Korea. And
Good.
I'm wondering if he's heard anything.
Okay. So Cortland, if you're out there, please feel free to chat in, please. Okay. Different question now from Anonymous. It says recently in Asia or Europe, tourism to North Korea has been getting more trendy, reportedly providing outsiders insights into North Korea to help opening up. It's also channeling foreign currency to the regime. So does foreign tourism help or hurt the human rights issue in your opinion?
Right now, I'd say there probably is very little tourism going into North Korea.
At this, this week.
The longer term question is tourism helpful or harmful? I'd say overall, fairly limited benefits. The tourism that's going on or that has been going on in the past into North Korea has been extremely tightly controlled by the North Koreans. People aren't allowed to go into North Korea and chat with people in the street, and people in the street aren't going to chat openly and freely about what's going on in their lives. There's not really an exchange of information. It's a source of income to the North Korean government, and people who go there and are traveling are paying a reasonably good price to be able to do that, and it benefits the North Korean regime. I think the benefits of travel are very, very limited, and seeing a few foreign tourists, particularly there for the Pyongyang Marathon, are not going to do a lot for improving conditions in North Korea.
Yeah, I saw the marathon was canceled this year because of the concerns about the coronavirus.
And if I may, Mark and Bob, both of you mentioned the 2019 US State Department report on the situation of human rights in the DPRK. For the first time ever, the State Department report included the case of Otto Warmbier, who died at the hands of the North Korean regime. Otto Warmbier was on a tour to North Korea when he was arbitrarily arrested, imprisoned. His imprisonment in North Korea resulted in his being sent back home more than a year later in a vegetative state. He passed away 1 week later. Other Americans had been detained before that. And of course, Bob, you had to deal with this as US Special Envoy for Human Rights in North Korea. So it is simply dangerous. And American tourists in particular are a target. If you talk to North Korean escapees, if you talk to senior defectors, escapees in particular, they will tell you that from a very young age, North Koreans are taught that America and Americans are the enemy. Of course, some of them see the light and understand what's going on, but one must really understand that traveling to North Korea is dangerous. A second aspect, full disclosure, I have endorsed and shared a petition currently ongoing on change.org. This is a petition initiated by a very good and close friend of mine who's a North Korean escapee. It's a petition to urge the international community to boycott attending mass games in North Korea. Egregious human rights violations happen during these public mobilization campaigns aimed at staging these massive mass games. In particular, children are victimized. Children become the victims of human rights violations during these mass games. The North Korean regime makes it a point to have foreign travelers participate as viewers in these mass games as a tool of delivering regime propaganda, using tourism to North Korea as a vehicle. So fundamentally, under the current circumstances, until North Korea adopts comprehensive economic, social, political reform, travel to North Korea is a bad idea.
Okay, I see that Cortland's replied by chat to the panelists, so you can see what he's replying to Bob's question. Let me ask you a question about terminology, because Greg, you used the term escapee for North Koreans. It seems like defector is the usual term used. I hear refugee used. I hear escapee used. What's the best term to use for these people who are just Koreans who have managed to get out of North Korea?
Certainly in the case of those who came to South Korea before and during the Korean War, the term a refugee is the most appropriate. refugee cannot be appropriately applied to others. Again, according to the Constitution of the Republic of Korea, every Korean is a citizen of the Republic of Korea. Every square inch of Korean land is the land of the national territory of the Republic of Korea. Certainly in the case of very high profile North Koreans who escaped and came to South Korea, the term defector might apply, because the term defector, we hear this a lot from human rights organizations and human rights activists who used to be involved in dealing with the human rights violations perpetrated by communist regimes in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Bob is really, really well familiar with that world, having done that work. So basically, the term defector has a certain connotation. This is a turncoat, somebody who turned against the regime, a senior military official, a senior government official. But certainly in the case of, say, a Tae Yong-ho, who was minister at the was DCM, Deputy Chief of Mission, at the DPRK embassy in London. In the case of Hwang Jang-yeop, was the top ideologue of North Korea. In the case of ambassadors and other senior officials who ended up in South Korea or other places, the term defector will apply. In the case of the overwhelming majority of those 33,000 North Koreans currently residing in South Korea, others residing in other countries, perhaps escapee is a better term to apply. They all escaped from oppression. They all escaped a terrible regime. One can make a very good argument that the entire country of North Korea is one gigantic gulag. It is only the level of repression and oppression that differs. Otherwise, in many ways, everyone is imprisoned in this predicament of the Kim regime.
Okay, Bob, do you have a term you prefer to use for Koreans who've managed to escape North Korea?
The South Korean terms, and I don't speak Korean, but my understanding is the South Korean terms are focused more on the refugee aspect than they are on the defector aspect, which is the term we tend to use in English. But as Greg mentioned, it has the ideological content that for some people is appropriate, but for a lot of them it's not. On the other hand, what we call them is probably less relevant than the fact that these are people who are getting away from a regime that has made their life painful. And whatever we call them, we need to be helpful and supportive of them.
Okay, all right.
And I think that is a very important point that Ambassador King raised. What is the Korean terminology used? All North Korean escapees refer to themselves as 탈북자. 탈출하다, to escape, 북 from Bukhan, North Korea, 자, individual, one who escaped from North Korea. The word for defector is 망명자. Very few of them refer to themselves as 망명자. They will refer to themselves as 탈북자. As Bob was saying, the South Korean government has experimented with other terms, 세터민, new settler, and so on and so forth. That didn't stick. So as far as the North Koreans residing there are concerned, probably escapee is the term that comes closest, I guess. But again, as Bob was saying, this could be an ongoing discussion, an ongoing debate.
Okay, that's helpful. Another question we have is, in light of the pandemic, is there anything we can do to force North Korea to properly care for the populations due to the global nature of the pandemic?
That one's a tough one because we're not in a position to force North Korea to provide for its own citizens. This is an obligation that every state ought to have. Seems to me the best thing that we can do is to emphasize the responsibility of the government to take care of the well-being of its own citizens and focus on that element of it. Most other countries are very sensitive and very attentive about the well-being of their citizens. The North Koreans give very little attention to the well-being of the vast majority of their citizens, and the elite, of course, get very very special attention. But I think what we've got to do is focus on the responsibility of a government to its own people and to their well-being. And this goes well beyond simply the pandemic. And I think that's where we start getting into the issue of human rights. If a government is concerned about the well-being of its people, it's not only their health, it's also the other aspects of the human rights: access to information, ability to make choices, freedom of movement, the other kinds of things that we talk about.
Perhaps, as shown by precedent, there isn't much we can do to force the Kim regime to look after its own people. One has to remember that globally we are dealing with a frightening, devastating force of nature. This coronavirus crisis will make many of us, even in the developed world, the world of constitutional republics or liberal democracies, perhaps change our perspectives on the world and change our way of life. As far as we know of now, we do not have a cure. We do not have a vaccine. The only way we can flatten the curve is by means of using behavior change campaigns. And of course, social distancing is one of the tools employed in the arsenal of dealing with COVID-19. Here's potentially a very big challenge for the North Korean regime. The North Korean regime fundamentally relies on collectivism. Collectivism and social distancing do not mix. Remember that this is a regime that relies on mass indoctrination of its own people. Of course, the regime might tell them, stop drinking soju and stop going to theaters. But what about the weekly Senghwa Tonghwa ideological training sessions? Will those stop as well? North Korea for more than 7 decades has been all about people living together and everybody watching everybody else and everybody being subject to multiple lines of surveillance, coercion, control, surveillance, and punishment. Can this collectivism, collective surveillance, collective oppression, collective punishment survive a coronavirus crisis? None of us know the answer. Many still wonder how come the regime did not collapse in the 1990s. Again, and please remember my wish to the people of North Korea. Again, 0 cases, 0 fatalities. Let's think of an absolutely potentially devastating scenario where perhaps almost half the population, 10 million, have been infected due to precarious hygiene, precarious public health. And let's assume a high fatality rate. What the World Health Organization is saying right now is 2 to 4%. Let's assume 5%. 5% of 10 million would be 500,000. That's how many people died in 1995 during the famine, according to Hwang Jang-yeop. According to the same Hwang Jang-yeop, 10% of them were party members, 50,000 of them. Well, if that did not bring down the regime, does it mean that the regime is prepared to deal and cope with that type of tremendous loss? We just don't know. These are all questions that will be answered, but I think that the million-dollar question, please excuse the cliche, is whether the collectivism preached by the North Korean regime can coexist with the type of behavior change that's needed in order to flatten the curve and avoid a catastrophic spread of the disease in North Korea.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. I'm not sure the 1990s will teach us much about what would happen today. I think things are different now. In the 1990s, the huge part of the population that relied on the state to save them from the famine died. And those who were prepared to scramble for some kind of resources of their own, who were more entrepreneurial, survived. So if it happened today that there was a real disaster in North Korea, and this could be it, I'm not sure how much the population would actually really believe the state would rest to save them, and how many try to find their own means of survival. Okay, See, what's another question we have in is, and this is getting very Washington, D.C.-ish, what would a Biden policy on North Korea look like?
Unfortunately, I don't think North Korea is the top of the list on either side in terms of upcoming presidential election. My sense is that there's a greater attention to human rights, likely from a Biden administration. And in part, that's because I think with a Biden administration, it's less likely to be the very personal kind of approach that Trump has taken. It's not based on a Trump, the Trump administration policy is largely based on the personal relationship between Trump and Kim Jong-un. I don't think that's going to be the case with Biden. I think there's going to be, if there's a Biden administration, I think it's going to be much more the kind of traditional US government approach where you look at the policies, you make the determinations, and it's not the personalities that try to make the difference. And from that point of view, I think it'll be more focused on the concrete actions that are taken in terms of dealing with the nuclear issue. And the importance of human rights is likely to come through more in that kind of an administration than one where it's very personality driven.
Yeah, go ahead, Greg, I'm sorry.
In my view, regardless of the result of the presidential election, the human rights issue in North Korea will be again elevated. Should President Trump be reelected, I think it would be reasonable to expect a harder line approach to North Korea. As Bob said, should we see a Biden presidency, it is likely that we will see a human rights component included in our policy toward North Korea. So again, one in this line of work, North Korean human rights in general, but in particular North Korean human rights, has to be an optimist. I have to be optimistic regarding the future.
Yeah, I agree that if there were a Biden administration, it would be more traditionalist approach. It would probably go back to working groups, special envoys, empowering negotiators. I mean, for me, the question's never been whether Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un trust each other. It's whether they each trust their own bureaucracies enough to be able to actually negotiate an agreement. It's a harder thing to do. It might be a more multilateral too. I can see a Biden administration trying to create more of a network again, working with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, with Russia, with China, with the EU, to try to pressure North Korea.
And I think with the Biden administration, there will be a different attitude towards the United Nations. I think the United States will resume membership in the UN Human Rights Council. I think we'll play a much more active role in terms of pressing the North Korea human rights issue in the United Nations the way we have in the past.
Yeah, if I had a wish for the next administration or even this one, I'd like to see him introduce human rights on the agenda with North Korea, but maybe in very specific ways. Maybe try to find some small step where you actually get something to happen, just as a beginning. So rather than saying you must improve your human rights record, which is unlikely to happen, we could say, would you please change your law so that family members of those who aren't imprisoned with you? That'd be a start, just something they might be able to do.
Regrettably, Mark, that is extrajudicial punishment. There are no laws in the book stipulating that family members be imprisoned together with a perceived offender. They're simply rounded up and taken away in the middle of the night.
Okay, let me take one more question. I think we'll wrap it up. The other question I have in the queue is, what do we think would happen if members of the elite in North Korea caught the coronavirus? Would that be more inclined to make them reach for outside assistance? Would it change their attitude?
It's certainly going to be a concern to Kim Jong-un, who's got to maintain the loyalty of the elite, and I think he's going to be very concerned about that. The difficulty is you can do some things to prevent the spread of the virus, which is what he's trying to do by enhancing the limitations on movement and that kind of thing. The availability of respirators seems to be the biggest issue, I think, that is likely to come up. And I'm not sure that there is much ability for the rest of the world to provide respirators to North Korea. When you look at the situation in the United States and the availability of respirators here, we're far below what we're going to need. And I'm not sure that that situation is different anywhere else. Is there much that can be done? And are there available resources that can be helpful to North Korea in dealing with the virus? I'm not sure there's that much that can be done. One of the things that probably is most helpful is sharing information. And this is something where we're quite willing to share healthcare information, and most other nations are willing to do so. But are the North Koreans willing to share information as to what their situation is? And only if they share information are other countries going to be able to offer suggestions and help and advice and potentially some material assistance to be able to deal with it. I'm not sure what the result will be and whether there's that much that can actually make a difference.
I also think that we have to keep in mind the very nature of the Kim regime in North Korea. This is not a regime keen on preserving, on safeguarding the human security, including the health security and human rights of its own people. Its fundamental strategic objective is its own survival. Does the regime want its people to die by the millions? Absolutely not. However, if what it takes is to sacrifice its own people by the millions, it will do it in the blink of an eye, as it has done it before. What if the elites were concerned about coronavirus? Again, let us remember the nature of the regime. Where did General Lee Kam-yong go? Oh, he's been quarantined. He has coronavirus. Where did the other 15 generals go? Well, they've been quarantined as well, together with their entire extended families, out of concern for the public health of North Korea. So that's the other very unfortunate side of what a public health crisis, what a coronavirus crisis may look like in North Korea. This may tragically provide the regime with a cover to do what it's been doing for a very long time, oppressing its own people, leading, staying in power through fear politic, through the politics of fear. And this applies first and foremost to the very elites of North Korea.
Yeah, I saw some reports, true or not, that Kim Jong-un has left Pyongyang. So he will take care of himself. I don't have to worry about him so much personally. All right, I think our time's almost up. So let me just ask Bob and Greg, do you have any last things you'd like to say before I close this out?
I'd like to say thank you to you, Mark. I think you've done a great job in terms of moderating this event. I'm struck that it's an interesting format to use, and under the circumstances, I think you've done a great job.
I would also like to join Ambassador King in thanking you, Mark, and your team at KEI. I know that everyone at KEI has put a lot of good and hard work into this for the past. My party. We are all in a very difficult situation. We are faced with a global pandemic. It is very easy to forget about the people of North Korea. It is very easy to forget that crimes against humanity in North Korea are still being perpetrated. It is very easy to forget that a slow motion refugee crisis has been ongoing for many years. I am grateful to you, Mark, to your team, to you, Bob, and to all those who have tuned in today. It is very important to know that the people of North Korea are not forgotten. And I would ask everyone who has tuned in today to continue to be an ambassador of North Korean human rights. We need your help. Please spread the word.
Okay, thank you. That's a great note to end on. So let me just thank you, Greg and Bob, for taking your time to participate. It was a good event. We're going to be doing more of these. So please, for those of you who watched or participated, thank you for tuning into us. Keep an eye on our website, keia.org, to see announcements of future events coming up. Okay, so thanks much. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.